In 1990, Nintendo wasn't just a company. It was a monopoly. They controlled 90% of the video game market. They bullied store owners, squeezed developers, and crushed competitors. They were the untouchable kings of gaming, but by the end of the decade, the king was bleeding. They had lost their market dominance, alienated their closest allies, and were being humiliated by a new rival, a rival that they personally created. This is the story of how Nintendo's arrogance in the 90s almost destroyed them. The decade began with a war. The console wars. Sega launched the Genesis with a brutal marketing campaign. Genesis does what Nintendo. They painted Nintendo as a toy for babies, while Sega was for the cool kids. For the first time, Nintendo was scared, but they fought back. They released the Super Nintendo in 1991. It was a technological marvel. With games like Street Fighter II and Donkey Kong Country, they slowly crushed Sega. By 1994, the war was effectively won. Nintendo was back on top. But while they were fighting Sega at the front door, they didn't notice the assassin sneaking in the back door. Years earlier, Nintendo wanted to add a CD-ROM drive to the Super Nintendo. They partnered with an electronics giant to build it, Sony. The contract was written, the prototype was built, and the device called the PlayStation was ready to be revealed at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. But the day before the announcement, Nintendo's president looked at the contract and got paranoid. He thought Sony had too much control. So in one of the most brutal corporate betrayals in history, he secretly flew to Europe and signed a deal with Sony's rival, Philips. At the CES show, while Sony executives waited to announce their partnership, Nintendo walked on stage and announced they were working with Philips instead. Sony was humiliated in front of the entire world. Furious, Sony executives went back to Tokyo. They almost scrapped the project, but one engineer, Ken Kutaragi, convinced the board to get revenge. They decided to take the technology they built for Nintendo and release it themselves. The PlayStation 1 was born. When the PlayStation launched in 1994, Nintendo laughed. They were working on their new beast, the Nintendo 64, but Nintendo made a fatal mistake. They refused to use C-discs. They stuck with expensive plastic cartridges to maintain control over piracy. This decision destroyed them. Cartridges were expensive to make and held tiny amounts of data. CDs were cheap and held massive amounts of video. Developers fled. Squaresoft, who had made Final Fantasy for Nintendo for years, told them, "We can't make our game on your cartridge." They moved Final Fantasy VII to PlayStation. It became the biggest game of the generation. Then came the Virtual Boy in 1995, a virtual reality headset that displayed only red and black colors, gave children migraines, and was discontinued in less than a year. It remains the biggest hardware flop in their history. By 1999, the numbers were brutal. The Sony PlayStation had sold over 100 million units. The Nintendo 64 had sold just 30 million. The king had been dethroned by the very partner they stabbed in the back. Nintendo survived, relying on Pokémon and Game Boy to keep the lights on. But the 90s taught them a painful lesson. If you try to rule the world alone, you might just create the enemy that destroys you. This is the Empire Files. Subscribe for the next investigation. Please leave a comment on your favorite game from this era: Street Fighter, Final Fantasy, Donkey Kong, or maybe Wipeout.